Welcome to Principles of International Relations. In today's class, we will talk about terrorism and civil wars. And unlike interstate wars, which we have looked at previously in this class, terrorism and civil wars have very often different mechanisms behind them. So territorial disputes are not necessarily at the essence of them. Very often they are based on regional, ethnic, or religious kind of differences, which lead to escalation of conflict into violence. In this class, I would really like to understand the reasons, but also the consequences of these kind of conflicts, how they are distinct from each other, how they are distinct from interstate disputes, and how we can categorize them, and in order to kind of understand them better, how we can kind of how countries can cope with these situations the best. So I hope you will enjoy this class, and I will go right into the slides. Thank you. Today I want to answer several questions around the topic of civil war and terrorism. And I kind of, the key kind of outlines could be seen as why does civil war actually occur within states? And what are the reasons for this to take place? In a way, we have discussed wars, interstate wars between different countries, and very often they're kind of tangible goods like a territory and others, which are kind of forcing these wars to occur. We also, of course, kind of discussed it as a failure of bargaining, and something like this is not only available in interstate wars, but also within states. There can be kind of serious fractions of society, which can be along cleavages like ethnic cleavages, etc., which can lead to violence of non-state actors as well. So, but the real question is, where does this come from? How does it explain? And why do some countries lead and some conflicts lead to situations of violence and up to civil wars, and others not? So is it sufficient to kind of think about civil war as only bargaining failure, or is there more to it? And one of the aspects which kind of suggests that there's more to it is the idea that basically it needs also resources and capacity to organize, overcoming the monopoly of power of the state, etc. So several features are necessary to lead and kind of a conflict of interest between non-state actors or non-state actors and state actors towards situations of civil war, and also towards situations of terrorism. And so in a way, I want to connect both topics, although they have quite some distinct features which are different from each other. But I want to connect them in this kind of idea from power struggle against the authority or against other non-state actors within the group, and what kind of see them as strategies of violence, but with also kind of look at their different purposes. And the last part, I want to kind of look at terrorism and also the prevention of terrorism. What is kind of the key features to prevent terrorism as well? So if we look at this map here, what we do see is terrorist incidences between 1971 and 2018. In a way, the different colors are based on ethnic versus other motivated terrorist attacks. What we do see that the majority of terrorist attacks are not necessarily ethnically motivated. They could be religiously motivated, they could be politically motivated in other forms. And we do see also a considerable number of ethnically motivated violence. The interesting part here is really that this kind of terrorism is spread over all over the globe in a way. So we have some kind of really areas of high incidences in India, Iran, also the Middle East, also in South America and vast parts of Africa, and also around Europe. But it is not in a way as singly it is not as concentrated in different locations which we normally associate with terrorist incidences. So why do I show you this map? It's basically to indicate that terrorist attacks can come in various forms, and also in countries and areas where you don't expect terrorist attacks to happen. They happen, but very often in slightly different shapes than we normally anticipate them. So I think we are talking about some phenomena which is quite widespread, and is really worth looking at it, not only from a perspective of looking at something which is kind of outside of our reach, but rather kind of look at it as something which is kind of more common than expected, and also kind of happens in areas which are close to our places as well. Well, what we do see here is a map of incidences which happened in the 1970s and 2016. And there are kind of three different lines. One is the green one, which shows the total amount of incidences. And what we do see here is that the number has constantly been rising. There has been a decline in 1992 shortly, but afterwards the incidences increased again, but on a relative low level. What we do see since 2010 is that the incidences are actually going up considerably. There is, since 2000, peak was reached 2014. Since then, there has been a little bit of a decline, but still the number of incidences is still very high. If we kind of correlate this with the amount of deaths and the injuries, we do see that they also kind of go along with this increase, but especially from 2010 on, we see a steep increase in injuries and deaths. That means that terrorist attacks actually became much more violent in this period. There's also a high number of deaths in the year 2000, and that is, of course, 2000. That's the 9/11 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York, in the United States. But especially since 2010, we have seen a high level of increase of deaths in terrorist attacks. So we can say that terrorist attacks actually become more violent and more deadly as a consequence. The question I would like you to kind of think about at this moment a little bit by yourself. So I would ask you to actually make a break here and kind of reflect on this question. And the question is, considering the present trend towards terrorism, that we have an increased level of terrorism, what strategies could prevent terrorism for on a long run basis? What are actually kind of useful and necessary mechanisms to reduce terrorism? And so please take a short break here and think about what you think would be good measures. If you want to write them down on our Padlet site, I would greatly appreciate it. I will look at them and see who wrote something, and I'm very curious what you have to say. So please do so if you have the opportunity. Okay, make a break now. Well, welcome back. After writing down your points, I would like to continue this lecture with talking more generally about violence of non-state actors. Something which the US experienced actually in both of their dominant recent wars, in Afghanistan as well as in Iraq, is situations of military might don't necessarily pacify countries. So what we did have there is that the United States was able to overwhelm the domestic military in these countries, but that doesn't mean that it actually appeased these countries. The countries have continued to stay violent and arguably have actually become more violent, and that kind of created a real kind of problematic situation for the United States, because suddenly it wasn't really visible anymore who the exact enemy is. And this destabilization led to a situation where the US needed to be much longer in the countries, and also lead to a situation where it's arguably not capable of appeasing the country and kind of bring it on a path to prosperity. There have been done many attempts, like building up a domestic military, building up an organized police force. Especially in Afghanistan, we can see that this is not very successful. That actually the former Taliban in recent years has become a stronghold again, and that the US started negotiating with the Taliban, the former power which was ousted by the Americans after the September 11, 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center, is currently again negotiating with the United States about a kind of peaceful, more peaceful situation in Afghanistan. Why is the US not capable of stabilizing these countries and kind of appeasing them? Well, because the military insurgent strategies used by some of the opponents are very difficult to handle, and this is something which was maybe a painful lesson to be learned for the United States. That actually kind of overpowering a country militarily is one thing, and keeping it stable and peaceful in the long run is a completely different thing. And the US has not been as successful in these kind of issues. If we think about civil wars for a moment, then that is a little bit of a different scenario, because we have here conflicting interests of civil groups. And they have very often different demands over territory, policies, or government composition. Very often they are fused by ethnic divisions. And one of the aspects which is really important is that the conflicting parties, the conflicting parties have to be organized sufficiently. Sorry, my apologies. Have been organized sufficiently to build up capacity, military capacity, and that has two important factors. One, that the state in itself is not strong enough to kind of suppress building up of the capacity. But at the other hand, it's also really relevant to see that the groups need to have this kind of capacity. And very often, a reason for building up this capacity is that there are support groups, very often from abroad and other areas, which can fund and resolve issues, not resolve, kind of fund and groups in order to kind of build up this capacity. Another issue, which is really very often common, is that there are resources like primary resources like diamonds and rare minerals, etc., which are very valuable and which can be seen as a continuous source of income for rebel/freedom fighting groups. And these kind of groups can fund themselves by these resources. So that is something which is really important, and to have a sustainable kind of conflicting situation. But at the same time, often this is kind of described, especially in situations like in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and other sub-Saharan African countries, that the availability of an overwhelming amount of natural resources fuels civil conflict in the region and in these countries. So if we look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, we can see that actually this is a very difficult situation, and a kind of political situation. And two things are really important in here. And then one is that the low capacity of the state to actually act as a monopoly of power within the state. So it has low levels of acceptance. It has also low levels of capabilities in order to kind of keep peace. Another really important aspect is that there are many different rebel groups, or many different groups which are fighting over territory within the within Congo or the DRC, and this is kind of, and that the DRC is has an abundant amount of natural resources, including diamonds, rare minerals, gold, and many other kind of valuable resources, which is used as a form of funding, as I mentioned before, for the rebel groups. But it's also that there's a large amount of external actors involved as well. So some of the neighboring countries, including Rwanda, and have been involved. And Burundi have been involved in this conflict. As on one hand, for sheltering groups which have lost in certain circumstances, but also in situations for being actively kind of pursuing their interests within Congo. At the same time, we can see that the DRC has also played a vital role in the neighboring Rwanda and its conflict, and including the genocide, and was kind of utilizing this. So we can see that civil wars are kind of cross-fertilizing each other, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. One more question which we really kind of should ask ourselves, and is really interesting, is why do we have these kind of civil wars? What are the kind of the motives of forms of conflicts? And very roughly, we can kind of distinguish between two different forms. And one is grievances, and the other is greed. So what do we mean with grievances? Grievances are if government policies discriminate against certain groups. Very often this is done on an ethnic basis, and is kind of singling out a group and they're acting against it. So it can be that the distribution of wealth, it can be the quality of life, it can be kind of the limitation of the freedoms, etc. These kind of grievances lead to gaps between different societies, and therefore increase the frictions, increase the tension, and therefore can lead to hatred and violence within it. So these are very often kind of reasons for maybe regional groups to kind of stand up and fight against the state power. Another aspect which is very common is the idea of greed, and that is maybe the opposite. And it is the group desires to control the greater share of economic resources and profit. It would like to have privileged access to jobs in the government, for example, or others. So this kind of greed is kind of the situation here is very different, and it becomes that the kind of rebel mechanism is a source of power and a source of funding for a specific group. This is, for example, has been true in countries like Colombia, where the Civil War facilitated not just political ideas, but it also facilitated the possibility to grow drugs and make lots of money from these kind of drugs. The same thing has been partly true in Afghanistan, where opium has been produced and kind of sold with high level of revenues. And the same is true in sub-Saharan countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where different kind of rebel leaders are kind of using their territory in order to produce so-called blood diamonds and other kind of high-value products which can be sold sold abroad, and therefore kind of are leading to high levels of revenues. So in a way, the grievances and the greed kind of are kind of aspects are very often tied together, and in a way are at the center of the conflict, of the origins of the conflict, but also at the center of the solutions of these kind of conflicts. Question, of course, we could ask ourselves later on is then, when does this kind of dissatisfaction lead to armed opposition? In a way, we can expect that opposition is happening in many different kind of places, but not necessarily they're always kind of leading to violence or civil war. So what are the mechanisms which are really leading to this? And some of the aspects is that, of course, groups are can be dissatisfied. They could even try to leave the state. They could try to alter the policies, or try to take over the state. So these are kind of three mechanisms which are very kind of frequent in civil unrest and civil wars. Leaving the state, separatist movements are very common and very often feel that their only possibility to kind of reach their goal is to resort to violence. Dissatisfied group which try to alter the policies are less common, because most countries have a mechanism of kind of altering policies. But in some situations, it seems impossible to alter the policies, because maybe the centralist state is not listening at all, it's overpowering, or it has kind of diametrically different interests than the citizens in the specific place. And we do see that this kind of leads to violence as well, and also to kind of conflict where people feel the necessity that the only way they are heard and their kind of policy concerns are heard is through violence. Sometimes we do have situations like the third one, where movements would like to take over the state, kind of take it over as in a term of political revolutions, etc. This is much rarer than the other forms, but it does exist as well. And it is, of course, kind of some of the revolutions which we had, and like including the French revolutions we had in Europe, and in other parts of time where regime change has taken place, are often also kind of falling under this category, and often are violent as well. In terms of separatist movements, where we see that this is kind of to create an independent state, can be seen in several places as well, sometimes successful, sometimes not successful. East Timor would be an example for this, but also, of course, Eritrea. The creation of Eritrea in recent years can be seen in this way. Why do we feel? Why do we have this idea that there is armed opposition? Well, we could kind of, one of the examples we can see is that very often political systems are failing and are not becoming responsive to the needs of the citizens anymore. So one example I would like to highlight here is the developments which we had during the Arab Spring. So bad working conditions, very high unemployment, corruption, nepotism, and other forms have in many Arabic countries led to a situation which was undesirable and quite desperate by the citizens, and especially young citizens. And in this, what we have seen during the Arab Spring is very similar demands in many different Arab countries. So in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain, we have seen like factors which led the citizens to go on the streets, protest, and demand changes in the political system. But what we do find is that this has been handled very differently depending on what kind of state we are talking about. Most of the states where the Arab Spring has taken place have been authoritarian states, but not everywhere they led to violence. But for the most maybe prominent cases where this led to a violent outburst is in the situation of Syria and the situation of Yemen. And in both of these countries, which is really kind of noticeable, is that there has been no incentive by the governments to kind of give in at all and kind of listen to the desires of the citizens and kind of be willing to make any changes, which subsequently led to increased level of violence. At the same time, what we do have in both of these countries is that a minority, which is also ethnically distinct from the majority of the country, is trying to rule this and kind of feels that has a right to rule over the different parts, and therefore this has been kind of delegitimizing the governments as well. So very often we find that violence is not necessarily the opus moderandi in the very beginning, but kind of an escalation mechanism which is created if demands are kind of continuous to be suppressed. Well, in a way, if we kind of try to kind of distinguish different forms here even further, we can kind of think about different factors in armed opposition. So we can kind of think about the group level in the nature of the interest. So what kind of interests does the conflicting groups have? What kind of interests do they pursue? But we can also kind of think about the nature of their the origin of their motivation. We can see like this could be rooted in ethnic differences, in religious differences, in class differences, etc. So we have specific interests, but we have also motivations, and these are kind of the distinguishing factors. And if we kind of disentangle issues like this, we very often find that the roots are not necessarily only in the interest base, but rather that the interests are a symptom of the underlying nature of the motivations. We do have also kind of course, country-level factors. So, for example, the political institutions and the regime-type authoritarian regimes feel very often more threatened by political change and demand of change by their citizens, and are more likely to kind of try to regain their power by the use of violence. Something which we have seen in the Arab Spring quite consistently is that the countries which are the most authoritarian are the ones which are most resorting to violence in kind of suppressing interests by certain groups of the population. Another aspect which is really important is the economic situation of the country. In a way, statistically speaking, poor countries are much more likely to experience civil conflict and unrest. One of the aspects here can be seen in the political system. We do find that democratic systems are very often less likely, statistically speaking, less likely to be poor, and lots of theories indicate that democratic societies are better in kind of interest mediation between different fractions in society. But there is another aspect to this, and this is the capacity of the state. So very often in poorer countries, the capacity of the state is limited as well, which kind of creates the opportunity for separatists or other kind of groups to resort to violence. So this becomes easier if the capacity of the state to kind of control and monitor issues is limited. Something which is also really kind of interesting and important is that armed opposition is very often also kind of not only affected by domestic issues, but also by international factors. So what we do see, especially in in several of the civil wars in Latin America, as well as in Africa, is, as well as in the case for in the Middle East, like for example in Syria, is that we have opposing international interests as well. Just to take the case of Syria, we do have in the West, the interest of the West of stability within Syria and the wider region. We do have interests of Iran as a regional power, kind of trying to kind of dominate the region, and therefore kind of have an effect in the conflict as well. In a way, it is often seen as a conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which are on opposite sides, and try to kind of influence their power or kind of show the supremacy of their influence in the region. And of course, on a global level, also countries like Russia have an interest in the region, want to put a mark on it. And so what we do see in these situations is that very often conflicts like this become something like proxy wars, where interests of outside parties are kind of played out on the territory of specific countries, which makes it even harder to solve these kind of conflicts. Well, some new kind of form of research is very often how we can see civil wars is that we could actually see it in a very similar way as a bargaining failure, as we have seen between countries. So something which is, of course, existent is the idea about asymmetric information. How strong are the different parties and how to mediate between them? So issues like asymmetric information, commitment problems, like shift of relative power from one actor to another, making concessions of by the government might require disarmament of the rebels, etc. All of these kind of power struggles can also be captured in a bargaining environment, and so we do find that lots of these kind of conflicts are very difficult to resolve because of asymmetric information and the role of commitment problems. Sometimes we also do see that indivisible goods are at stake and therefore make it more difficult. But I would feel this is rarer than the other factors I just discussed above. Well, I mentioned already, so the question we could ask ourselves is, what can be done about civil wars? Is that something which is inevitable, or do we have forces or possibilities to help countries to resolve their conflicts more peacefully? And I talked already about a great deal of outside interference in order to kind of use these territories as proxy conflicts and proxy wars, which actually is fueling the conflict rather than kind of limiting it. And so the question here is more like, can outside actors also play a positive role? Can they appease situations? And there are possibilities, for example, especially in issues like commitment problems. So outside actors can kind of resolve commitment problems by being a monitor of these situations. and help therefore to reintegrate different groups into society. And of course, also by kind of providing economic and political support in ways of a kind of rebuilding institutions, but also restructuring. And again, by overlooking the process, being like an impartial mediator. The problem, which is really very apparent in lots of conflicts, is that the willingness is not necessarily there, and very often there's a high level of distrust because of the negative experiences many parties had with outside interference. Another way to help countries which struggle with civil wars and ethnic cleavages are much more long-term initiatives rather than kind of short-term initiatives. And one of the aspects here is that actually economic development and democratizations are key in kind of reducing the risk of civil wars. And so a route to development and democratization can of course be very, very kind of difficult, but at the same time, it can also be the only kind of long-term solution towards conflicting countries. So one thing which is really important is, at the one hand, of course, to promote democracy in order to kind of have an effective way of dealing with different kind of preferences of political opinions without and having a mediation process built within the system. But at the other hand, also to kind of help economic development in order to kind of reduce the cleavages between the countries, between the different conflicting groups. In a way, a very different question is the idea about terrorism. So what we do find in civil conflicts is very often they have very concrete reasons for creating or using violence. And often this violence is seen as the last resort because their interests are not heard, or their rights are limited so much that they don't really feel other opportunities than to retrieve to violence. In the situation of terrorism, this is very often completely different. And very often the real purpose of the real purpose is the violence in itself, rather than kind of having a very kind of concrete goals. And that's something which we actually find very often in terms of terrorism, also related to Islamist terrorism, that it is not necessarily that concrete goals are kind of developed, which have to be met, and which are kind of a bargaining situation, but rather that this situation is something which is so we can see terrorism as a form of asymmetric warfare. And the asymmetry really comes from the idea that there are unequal military capacities. So the reason why terrorism is done primarily by extremist groups is because one of the features is that it doesn't need to rely on an extensive form of support by the civilian population. Something which is really important in a civil war for a group is that they have general acceptance. With terrorism, this is not the case, because terrorists normally don't show themselves publicly as being supportive of a certain action, but are rather doing this by hiding. Very often also the factor is not necessarily that the idea of terrorism is to kind of follow certain goals and kind of use and demand them, but rather kind of the real factor of spreading terror and insecurity in society. Of course, we have to be careful with the term terrorist, because very often governments are trying to delegitimize actors by calling them terrorists, also if they're not necessarily kind of per se following the definition of terrorist actors. So what I wrote here at the end is one's freedom fighter is somebody else's terrorist. So this is a matter of perspective, but also politicizing this term in order to kind of discredit a certain needs. For example, frequently in the Chinese press, Hong Kong students, protesters have been kind of called terrorist actions. While there were kind of elements of violence, it doesn't really fit the description of terrorism as we would use them in our scientific environment. So in this way, terms can be politicized in order to delegitimize actions as well. And we have to be careful kind of to distinguish between the real ones and the others. Again, we could kind of see terrorism as bargaining failure, and I want to kind of use this to kind of contrast it with the ideas of civil wars. But there's one really big difference. So we do have kind of, first let's talk about the kind of the bargaining situation. Terrorism is, of course, a form which is really hurtful for the society at large, and also especially for government, because it can't guarantee one of its key factors, and that is saving citizens or kind of securing the livelihood of citizens. And it lets, in any case, it lets states look quite weak. At the same time, bargaining is a threat which is working very, very effectively because it kind of spreads terror. So the reason that it can be done anywhere, normally the purpose of it is the maximum level of destruction, and this kind of maximum level of destruction is creating, making people very fearful of these events being happening, because it's very unpredictable where they would happen and when they would happen. What we do see is with terrorist targets, normally there are kind of taking place at situations where lots of people can be affected. So what we do see very often are situations like where there's high frequency, like train stations or airports and kind of significant transport hubs are popular goals, or kind of areas where lots of people are frequenting, like the terrorist attacks in Paris, which targeted bars and restaurants, etc. So one of the main purposes of the reasons for this is actually that people can associate themselves with being in these places, and it kind of creates a maximum level of scare among larger parts of the population that they could be a victim of this form of violence. And so in this situation, if we kind of see this as a bargaining situation, of course, the optimization terrorists would do is to kind of increase the maximum impact of their attacks. One of the aspects which are problematic in terms of bargaining is that normally we have clear defined benefits and costs. Very often terrorism is not necessarily kind of defined by goals, as I mentioned before, but rather by the fact of creating terror in itself. And that becomes very problematic in kind of describing it as a bargaining situation, because the means are the ends, so to say, and therefore the terrorists are not necessarily having any further goal, like specific goal, than creating terror. So in a way, if we think about Islamist terrorism, they do have goals, but these goals are very vague and very often very kind of inconcrete or vague, and that is on purpose, because they are then not necessarily easy to fulfill and kind of negotiable, but rather kind of something which is a kind of a long-term aspiration. So even if there a mutual beneficial bargaining might exist in theory, it is very difficult to actually achieve this, because maybe the incentive of terrorists to reach an agreement is not necessarily there. The last question I would like to address in this lecture is: can terrorism be prevented? And something what we can say is two aspects which are really important. Often we do have shadowy organizations which have very kind of organizational, like very fluent organizational structures. And the other thing is this kind of organizational structure makes communication diffuse and very kind of difficult to observe in reality. But there are certain ways to kind of deal with terrorism. The one is actually to kind of have a consistent monitoring system in place. However, this kind of monitoring system is often also interfering with civil liberties of regular citizens. And that is something which is very problematic in a kind of fighting terrorism, that we do have a trade-off between civil liberties and the fight of terrorism. And every society has to see where it draws the lines in kind of cutting the civil liberties in order to kind of be able to surveil terrorists. The other thing, which is maybe the most long-term, the most important factors, are to kind of understand what kind of factors draws people towards terrorist organizations, and trying to find a situation to mediate these conflicts. So what we do find in extremist organizations in Europe, not only Islamist groups, but also right-wing extremists, and even in some parts left-wing extremists, is that we have a certain situation that parts of society are perceived as outsiders and are not kind of taken serious, and very often disfortunate economically and in social status. And these kind of ghettoizing and stigmatizing of different groups is becoming problematic, because that leads to a higher level of acceptance of extremist groups. And so in terms of long-term kind of opportunities to prevent terrorism is actually to kind of increase cohesion and communication within society, trying to eliminate outsiders and discrimination of specific groups in society. So this kind of is probably the best way to prevent terrorism. At the same time, and therefore it enables you to dry up new supporters of terrorist activities. And this can be successful. We do see that the Red Army force in Germany, for example, has dried up after a certain time. Once support was not was dwindling, but it is a difficult kind of process, and it's not guaranteed to be successful. Other things are more like hands-on approaches. Is what we do see as defensive measures is to be preemptive to stop terrorists, and this is kind of. But the problem here is that very often this is very costly, politically very costly, and also difficult to achieve. So what we do find is that terrorist attacks are many countries are kind of not don't have an effective system to prevent, to be preemptive in terms of preventing extremism and terrorist attacks. But as I said before, the most important factor here is probably not the detection and the monitoring, but the social aspect of extremism and following of extremism, terrorism, to kind of see what kind of grievances are within society engage with these kind of grievances in a way, absorb them within the mechanisms of the society to kind of peacefully prevent actions rather than the resourcing to violence. So in a conclusion, I would like to say that rebellion and terrorism poses a challenge for any kind of state in terms of in a very fundamental sense, but that there are certain aspects which make this worse. And so what we do find is that authoritarian states are kind of much more challenged by it because they don't have an easier, like an built-in mechanism of interest mediation. It also is important to, of course, say that very often the roots are for especially for civil conflict are within society and are not necessarily kind of or very often should not be necessarily suppressed, but rather kind of adapted and kind of found a non-military, like a non-conflict way of dealing with these specific problems, rather than kind of trying to suppress the matter. We can, in this way, see this as a bargaining between non-state actors and state actors, or among non-state actors. Having said that, a conflict resolution, once a civil conflict or a terrorism is existent, is very difficult to resolve. So it is much better to kind of have an effective mechanism beforehand already.